So Sal, I always like to kind of start out big picture and just say, give us the state of the union of education. What do you think is working well? What is not working well? And just give us that context, and then we'll get into specifics on your recent work.
Well, I'll start. It's easy to get cynical about education globally, but especially in the U.S. But I always start giving a historical perspective. For most of human history, most people did not get an education unless you were pretty affluent. And it was about 200-300 years ago that folks said it was in places like the United States and the UK and what would become Germany and Japan. Hey, we should have mass public education. And that took literacy rates in these places from the 20, 30, 40% range to the 90+% range. And it's not a coincidence that these are the same places that were the first places to industrialize, the first places to have a broad middle class. So there's a lot of good things that happened. If you go back 300 years ago, algebra was considered a very esoteric subject that professors would debate. Now we expect middle school students to know it. So society on a historical arc has come a long way. And even if you look at the last 20 or 30 years before the pandemic, there was and if we were to focus on, well, actually the world, but even in the US, you've seen a lot of the world became wealthier, more people entered the middle class. And even in the United States, even though there's a lot of cynicism, there has been a steady march of improvement until the pandemic, and then the pandemic we saw a fall off. But with all of that said, things are still pretty bad if you think on a broader level, especially relative to our expectations. I always point out, a lot of what I talk about is personalization, as you alluded to, mastery learning, which is just a fancy way of saying that if you haven't learned something well, you should have the opportunity incentive to learn it. I talk a lot about competency, which is kind of the corollary of mastery, which it shouldn't matter how long you sit in a seat. It should matter whether you know the material or not. And it's pretty clear that the seat time based system is failing a lot of our students. If you here in California, if you look at students who graduate from high school and decide to go to the community college system in California, you're looking at about 60 or 70% of those students don't place into college algebra. And college algebra is a euphemism for 9th or 10th grade math. They essentially place into 6th or 7th grade math. So even though they've been sitting in seats for years in classes called Algebra 1, Algebra 2, Geometry, some even take pre-calculus and calculus, when they go to a community college and first time they take a placement test, the community college says, you're not even ready to learn algebra yet. And it's not a lot better at four-year colleges. In most four-year colleges, it's about 50% of students aren't even placing into college algebra. And college algebra itself, which once again is 9th or 10th grade math at best, tends to be still one of the biggest blockers for people getting their four-year degree. And I just use that as an example. We could also talk about writing. I've talked to a lot of university presidents and provosts, some of the top universities in the world, and they're seeing fewer and fewer people be able to write at what you would consider a college level. And this is a problem because AI is going to provide a lot of opportunities, but I think we suspect it's going to provide a lot of opportunities for those who can really amplify themselves using it. The AI is going to be able to do a lot of things, but I think you have to be quite skilled in order to be able to be amplified by it. And we're hopefully going to have a more abundant society, but you're also going to have a lot of economic dislocation from it. So you want as many people who have the skills and the capability to shift and be dynamic in a very dynamic world we're getting into.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And so, Sal, let me have you deep dive on this issue about where students are placing and what they have not achieved. If you said, what is the root cause of that? And then how much of what you're doing and how much of what AI is going to do is going to solve that problem? Is it going to solve 80 or 90% of the problem? Or you know what? There's a lot of other things that exist today that are problems.
I'll start saying, we should have no delusions that you could just drop a technology in and it'll just, solve all of the problems. But I think it can start making a dent. The root of a lot of what I just described, especially on the academic front, is, in my mind, students accumulating gaps in their learning. As you mentioned, I back in the day, almost 20 years ago, I was an analyst at a hedge fund. I was a year out of business school. I had just gotten married. My cousin Nadia, I was born and raised in New Orleans. She had visited. I was in Boston at the time. She was visiting after our wedding with her family. And when I learned that she wasn't doing well in math, she was having trouble, I offered to tutor her. And what I immediately saw when I started tutoring her is that she just had gaps in her knowledge. And adding and subtracting fractions, multiplying, dividing decimals, and that was making 7th grade unit conversion really hard for her. And the benefit of a personal tutor is I could zero in on that, and I could spend a little bit of time making sure that she was fluent at dividing decimals. And she went to a good school. But if you're a teacher with 25, 30 kids in the classroom and they all have different gaps, and at the same time you have to cover these 180 standards in 180 days or whatever, it's very hard to zero in on each of those students. And middle class, upper middle class, affluent families have always known this, and that's why you've either had tutors, or if you have someone in the family in a position to support their kids, that would also happen. And when I saw that happen, with a little bit of help, my cousin went from essentially being behind her class to being one of the strongest students in her class, and word spreads in my family, free tutoring is going on. Before I know it, I'm tutoring 10, 15 cousins every day after markets closed. And but it was the same pattern. No matter whether they were studying calculus or physics, the reason why most of them were struggling with calculus is that they had gaps in their algebra. Why they were struggling in physics, they had gaps in calculus or algebra or even arithmetic. And so that's where the personalization really helped. And so everything that Khan Academy has been doing, and as you mentioned, Khan Academy is much more than me now, it's really been trying to approximate, our mission as a nonprofit is free world-class education for anyone, anywhere. And world-class to us is, one, a high level of rigor. I think some of the problems that I mentioned with the remediation in, say, even California is students take classes called Algebra 2 and pre-calculus and calculus, but they aren't really at a world-class level of rigor. They tend to get watered down as kids accumulate gaps. But it's not just rigor, it's also personalization. That we don't want to do the factory model. If a student gets a 70% on a test, the traditional seat time-based system comes out of the Industrial Revolution. We'll just move on to the next concept, because everyone's on the same conveyor belt, moving with the class, and somehow you're trying to build on that 30% gap. But if you can approximate tutoring, which is what we've been trying to do at Khan Academy, with things like on-demand video, with things like software that gives you practice at your learning edge, with things like teacher tools, so that teachers can start to personalize for those 30 kids, we've believed, and we have actually a lot of evidence now, that actually will accelerate students pretty dramatically. And so when AI came onto the scene and we saw what was capable of, and we were lucky, I believe we were the first folks that OpenAI reached out to 6 months before ChatGPT came out. So this was almost 2 years ago. AI has a lot of issues. We could talk about those, even surprisingly bad at math in a lot of cases, but it could take on the persona in a very substantive way of a tutor. And in a lot of ways, what Conmigo can now do is indistinguishable from when I used to get on instant messenger with my cousins 20 years ago. And so our hope is, and we're seeing some evidence that it can unblock students, it can answer questions, things that videos and traditional exercises can't do. But one thing that we've realized in this whole journey of Khan Academy is you can make the best technology, et cetera, and there's probably 10, 15, maybe 20% of the population that will naturally pull it and use it. But a lot of folks just aren't going to show up. And so you need to work on motivation generally. And probably the biggest lever there is working with teachers and parents, because they're the biggest motivational mechanic.
Okay, so in terms of the root cause, I want to make sure this is a fair statement, that one of the big problems is the one-to-many model, which does not account for differing learning needs, et cetera. And then if you get down to the next level, the second problem is if you say, well, you need tutoring. Tutoring is expensive and it's not broadly available. It's 1% of the population. Is it fair to say that those are the two big problems, and this is why AI is going to be so important?
Generally speaking, yes. And that one-to-many, I think, and including myself, when I went on this journey, I thought it was purely an academic thing. Like, if only someone could help someone fill in that gap where they don't know how to divide decimals. That's part of it. And that was part of what I was doing with my cousins 20 years ago. But I've appreciated over the years that even when I was tutoring my cousins, a large part of it was the personal relationship, the motivation, making sure that they were staying on task, that they were staying organized, things like that. And that's oftentimes what a great teacher will do. But it's very hard when you have 30 kids in the classroom. So it's hard to zero in on their academic gaps. And it's also hard to sit next to all 30 kids and say, hey, what's going on in your life? How come you're not engaged? What can I do to help you? And I think AI could play a role in both of those, both directly and in supporting a teacher or a parent as they're trying to support students. And then, yes, the cost issue of 100 years ago, if we had infinite money, you could have had 5 awesome tutors in every classroom, or tutors that would just show up at people's houses, but we never had that. But AI now starts to make something like that plausible.
Makes sense. So now with all this lead in, tell us about Conmigo. As I mentioned, I use it as a kickoff case in my class, and I just love it because of the kind of technology overlap with societal need. Tell us about the genesis of Conmigo. Tell us where it stands, early results, all of those good things.
Yeah, it was it was summer of 2022. Sam Altman, Greg Brockman show us what would become GPT-4. As I mentioned, this was 4 or 5 months before ChatGPT came out. And even ChatGPT, there's an interesting story there where no one expected, including they didn't think there was going to be a thing. They just thought that they were making a little app on GPT 3.5 and the whole world kind of woke up. They thought GPT-4, we all thought GPT-4 was going to be the thing, which got released in March of 2023 that would wake people up. But when I saw what GPT-4 could do, and this was the first model that could really, people will critique it for its capability of reasoning, et cetera, but compared to previous generation models, it could actually make sense. It could actually take on personas. It was steerable. And so we immediately said, how can we make this emulate what a great tutor would do? We immediately said, all right, when students are doing exercises on Khan Academy, they have videos as a support, they have hints as support, they have articles. Well, we should put an AI that knows what students are trying to do, that knows the context of the video. And if a student asks a question, what did Sal mean when A leads to B at minute 2? The AI could answer it. If a student says while doing an exercise, why do I need to learn this? Conmigo will usually say something, well, what do you care about? And say, well, I want to be a doctor. And then it'll try to connect it to that. And it'll remember that too. And then students can reset it, et cetera. One of the things that we realized when we saw it, and obviously the world now realize this, is, well, that it could be a cheating tool. If you put students under 18 on this, how do you make sure they're not doing shady things with it? How do you make sure that there's solid data privacy? So we put a bunch of guardrails. Conmigo won't cheat. It makes every interaction that you're doing with the AI transparent to the teachers. If you do something really shady, it'll actively notify teachers, parents, administrators. A lot of, I don't know, in higher ed, there's still a lot of fear around, well, what about essays and students cheating on essays? We've just released what we called Writing Coach. This is the first version. Hopefully you'll see more of it in the next year. But what it is a teacher can create an assignment with Conmigo, assign it. The student then, Conmigo says, hey, I'm your coach. Let's work on this assignment, this writing assignment, and work on thesis statement together. There's an outlining tool. There's an editing tool. It feels a little bit like a Google Doc where it'll highlight parts of the document and give you feedback. And then when the student's ready, they submit to the teacher or the professor. And now, when most of us were going through school, the teacher or professor just gets the final output of the essay. They had, even before AI, they didn't know where that essay came from. There have been services on the internet for the last 15 years that will write your papers for you for $5 a page. People have been, fraternity brothers, sorority sisters have been sharing papers, things like that. So cheating predates AI, but AI we never knew where those papers came from. And even if people aren't cheating, the teacher or professor really didn't know where the process, where did the students struggle? How much time did they spend? But now the AI can make all of that transparent to the teacher because the student worked on the paper with the AI. And if the student copies and pastes from ChatGPT or some other source, the AI tells the teacher and says, hey, look, this part we didn't work on together and it's not consistent with Sal's other writing. We should double click on that. And we haven't done this part yet, but we're also working on being able to grade the papers according to a rubric with the professor or the teacher in the loop. So the AI isn't the final grader, but hopefully save the teachers a lot of time. So we've been going down that path. AI as a tutor, AI as a writing coach. There's even things that transcend what I would have done as a tutor, where you can have conversations with literary characters, AI simulations of literary characters, of historical characters, get into debates with AI. And then we realized there's a whole set of tools that could help teachers. Most of ed tech, one of the problems, including Khan Academy, is you say, hey, teachers, look, we have all these efficacy studies. If you just use it in this way, your kids could grow 30% faster, 40% faster. And most teachers want to do that. But then they go back to their classroom. They're already overworked. They have a million things to do. Now they have to learn a new technology. With Conmigo, we're able to now offer the teacher, and yes, it is one more thing for them to learn, but it can help them with their lesson plans, their grading papers, progress reports, et cetera. And we're already getting good feedback that it's saving teachers that are using it well as much as 5-10 hours a week, which is an immediate payoff for teachers. And then that hopefully makes them more likely to use that tool with their students. So we're still in early days. We've been doing some very light studies on engagement. I don't think that the AI by itself is what's going to drive efficacy. I think the AI's ability to unblock a student as they practice on traditional questions, et cetera, on Khan Academy and engage them and support teachers is actually what's going to be the thing in the near term that's going to drive most of the learning. But if you think about the 3 to 5 year time frame, as the models get better and better, I think they're going to be able to do more and more.
Yeah, and so Sal, tell us a little bit more about where the sweet spot is for Conmigo. Is it certain age groups, certain subjects, et cetera, or literally it's kind of all the stuff can be done concurrently?
Yeah, we're learning too. I initially, it's primarily text-based. There's text-to-speech and speech-to-text right now. We're starting to do some experiments. We have Khan Academy Kids, which is for ages 2 to 7. So we're starting to experiment with some of the more advanced multimodal models, being able to give you feedback on as you try to sound out a word or as you write something, or even learn language. So we're experimenting with that. We don't have that out in the world yet, but the Conmigo, as it's out in the world, you have to at least be able to type and read, et cetera. And it's interesting because even when we piloted with some of these third grade classes, second, third grade classes, where the students know how to read and write, at least at a basic level, at first, some of the places we saw it happen, I was like, oh, I don't know if this is right for the students, because they were writing strange things to the AI. But then their teachers pretty consistently said, no, this is really good for them, because right now they raise their hands and they say strange things to me that are kind of non sequitur or that aren't related to what's going on in the class. So it's giving them practice on articulating what they want and getting feedback. And oftentimes they're too shy to ask a question. But I think the sweet spot starts to, and we're seeing a lot of third, fourth graders love writing stories with the AI, that type of thing. And that's making them read more. They're able to write stories at a higher level of reading than they typically even read. But we're seeing definitely middle, high school, early college, and some of these core classes pretty powerful. And even beyond early college, where you can get into pretty deep conversations with the AI. You mentioned that study at Harvard. You can have, I've made videos on cosmology, but I always had a question. I never had an intuition why a supernova collapses, why it explodes. I would have assumed that it would just collapse if the fusion stops. Well, why wouldn't gravity just make it collapse? And so I go on Conmigo and I ask Conmigo, I'm like, hey, why does a supernova explode? And Conmigo's reaction was not what ChatGPT's reaction would be, which would be just to give you an explanation, looks like a Wikipedia article. It asked me, well, what do you know about how stars form? And I said, well, I know stars, there's enough matter, and then the pressure and the gravity, you start having fusion reactions, hydrogen goes to helium, blah, 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 and it releases energy. And so I said, well, when the fusions, supernova happens when the fusion stops, so I would expect it to collapse. And so Conmigo says, well, you have a pretty good understanding of the basics of star formation, but I have a question for you. You're right. It would collapse when the fusion stops, but do you think it would collapse quickly or slowly? And I said, well, it only happens to stars of a certain mass. I'll assume it happens quickly. And Conmigo asks me, have you ever seen anything collapse due to gravity or fall quickly without bouncing? And then that's when it clicked in my head. I'm like, oh, are you telling me that it collapses so quickly that it compresses the core of the star? And then there's a rebound, and then it kind of, the outer atmosphere gets jettisoned out into space? And Conmigo's like, yeah, absolutely. Imagine taking a ping pong ball on top of a basketball and bouncing it. The ping pong ball gets jettisoned out into the air. And that's an example of an interaction that I'm pretty sure when I had that interaction a year ago, if I just read a Wikipedia article, I went on ChatGPT, it would have gone through one ear and out the other. It wouldn't have really resonated. I had looked that up. I still couldn't, but this, by being Socratic, and interactive, really connected the dots.
Yeah, fascinating. So let me go through some of the stakeholder issues here, because one of them are tutors themselves. Is the implication of what you're saying is that Conmigo is starting to eclipse the performance even of a one-on-one human tutor? Is that fair to say?
No, I wouldn't say that yet. And I think As we said, human tutors are scarce and expensive, first of all. So, but I don't think I think there's always going to be a value of even my cousins back 20 years ago. They famously told me when I started making videos that they liked me on YouTube better than in person. But it's important to think about what they were saying and what they weren't saying when they said that. In some way, they liked having an on-demand version. They liked having access to explanations in the middle of the night, pause, repeat. They didn't have to feel embarrassed asking questions that they might have thought they should have learned 3-4 years ago. But we still were getting on the phone. And now we could spend more time digging deeper, doing higher order things, talking about their life, forming a human connection. And so I think if you have the resources for a human tutor, that's still going to be great. I think there's always going to be something very powerful about someone else taking interest in your life. Now, while that happens, hopefully the AIs can get better and better and better so we can start making that type of an experience more accessible to more people. But and maybe in some cases it might be a replacement. It might work better for other folks. And to be clear, we have a whole other nonprofit that we started during the pandemic called schoolhouse.world, which at some point we might bring back into Khan Academy. It started as an experiment, but it's now, this month it's running 18,000 boot camps, free tutoring, human tutoring over Zoom. And the way that we're able to do free tutoring is, like, say these SAT boot camps we're running, these are kids with over 1,500 on their SAT tutoring other students taking the SAT, and they've gone through training, they've been vetted, et cetera, et cetera. So, not only are we investing in Conmigo, we're also investing in ways of scaling up human tutoring, high quality human tutoring, because we don't think they're mutually exclusive.
Interesting. Very helpful. And let me ask you about teachers now. The experience that seems to be at a macro level on technologies, you get this broad distribution of reactions to technology, right? When ChatGPT and OpenAI came out, some people said this is the best thing that's ever existed. The other people said this is the end of the human species as we know it. And obviously there's a broad middle range. What has been your reaction that you've seen from teachers on this? Are you seeing the same kind of distribution of response, and you have to be really thoughtful about how you introduce it?
I don't want to jinx it, but so far, when we were starting to work on this, we were having all these debates inside of Khan Academy. There was a good group, and even I was steeling myself for maybe a lot of blowback that Khan Academy, you're jumping into AI. There's a lot of open questions about AI. It can make math errors. It can hallucinate, et cetera, et cetera. When we released, it was strange because there was generally, I would say, someplace between neutral to positive reactions. To some degree, it might have been when ChatGPT came out in November of 2022. I was annoyed because we were under a non-disclosure agreement with OpenAI. It was the most top secret thing that we had ever worked on, that I had ever worked on. And then all of a sudden this thing comes out, and I asked Greg Brockman, I'm like, hey, what are y'all doing? We're all lawyered up, and you just released something. And they said, no, we just thought we were just trying out this chat interface. And on top of an old model, and that unlocked people's minds on how to use AI, et cetera. And I was pretty bummed because immediately school systems started banning ChatGPT, AI as a cheating tool, GPT 3.5 in particular, especially when you didn't engineer some education-focused guardrails around it. It wasn't something that was particularly accurate or good at math, and so schools started banning it. But by the time we launched, about 4 months later, I think people had come full circle where they said, hey, this is going to be part of people's lives. If only someone were to put guardrails on it, make it better at math, safer, more pedagogically aligned, keep teachers in the loop. So we saw a pretty positive reaction, and we launched it. Was it 2 years ago as a bit of a pilot? We're like, hey, 10,000 people will learn a lot. And then by this time last year, we had about 30,000 folks on it. We're like, okay, that's interesting. Maybe this time next year we'll have 100,000. Yeah, but right now we're pushing about 400,000 students on it and about 300,000 teachers on it. And this is in a world where the student use case, the computation for generative AI is much more expensive than just serving up a website. So we've had to formally partner with school districts that are actually paying for the computation for the generative AI. So it's not like some free thing, well, we'll try it out. This is 300,000-400,000 schools and publics. Well, we're also outside of the United States, but mostly in the United States. that are paying to use this. They're at least paying for the computation. And then on the teacher side, Microsoft gave us a huge compute grant, $32 million of compute for 2 years, so that we could give the teacher tools for free. You know, these aren't the low cost models. These are the frontier models that even Microsoft will charge you $20 a month for, that we're able to give to teachers. So the reception has been far more positive than we thought. And I think teachers are very quickly seeing that this can help them with a lot of the work that they didn't enjoy doing. They used to spend hours writing lesson plans, grading papers, IEPs. I could go down the list.
Yeah. And Sal, when you see kind of go the future of this and see how it's getting deployed, do you see an environment where candidly public school budgets are strapped? There's just not enough money to go around. You have a tool like this that can turbocharge productivity in the classroom. You don't need as many teachers as time goes on. And it's a different model of education. Do you see that happening? And you say, yep, that is the case, but you know, we have an aging population, there's a shortage of teachers, et cetera. Or there's gonna have to be some kind of reconciliation of where you have the machine, where you have the human, and how many people do you need in the loop?
I don't think so. It's obviously impossible to, I mean, we're definitely not advocating for that. And I mean, just to put things in perspective, when we think about resourcing in public schools, you know, I'll go to the extreme example. New York City Public Schools spends almost $40,000 per student per year. So, and they have a pretty decent student-teacher ratio, 25-1. So imagine it's $1 million for every 25 students. Right now, New York City pays their teachers pretty well, but the fully loaded costs, including the pension and the insurance, et cetera, for a teacher, even the most senior teachers, maybe maxes out at $200,000 a year. Where's the other $800,000? I mean, I know you're saying, oh, there's multiple teachers, but if you imagine just one teacher, the same teacher with, you know, the same group of students, where's the other $800,000? It's going into all of these layers of administration, et cetera. And some of that makes sense. You need, you know, people who can support certain programs. You need some layers of management, but it seems pretty intense to me to have 80% of overhead versus, you know, and 20% is actually student facing. So I actually would hope that AI can free up more of those 80% of resources that are more on the administrative side, so that you can actually bring more resources into the classroom. Would be the ideal. But you know what we always talk about at Khan Academy, whatever the resources you have, we want to raise the ceiling, ideally if you have a great, well-resourced classroom, but we also want to raise the floor. If you, even at $40,000 per student per year, you know, California is closer to about $25,000 per student per year. There are still schools in both of these places that aren't teaching calculus, that aren't teaching a proper chemistry course. At least maybe they are, but it's not a rigorous one. So there we also want to raise the floor, where we can give access to that. We can allow that if there is a teacher that can teach it to help drive personalization. But if you're in rural Alaska, if you're a young girl in Afghanistan, and we have stories of young girls in Afghanistan, Taliban keeps them from going to school, and Khan Academy is kind of their education lifeline. We want to raise the floor for them.
Excellent. Let me ask you one last question, then I want to do my so what's here. There's a bunch of questions from our participants about how will you measure success? How are you measuring success of Conmigo itself? How do you measure success for Khan Academy? So product level all the way down to enterprise level and societal level.
Yeah, you know, historically at Khan Academy, we said, okay, impact. We want to maximize our positive impact on the world. Now, how do we do that? Well, you first have to reach people in order to impact them, and it's easy for us to measure how many people we're reaching. You know, we're technology based, so we can keep track of that pretty well. And then the next thing, well, you don't want to just reach them; you want to engage them. You want to see how much time they're spending with you. So for impact, it's reach times engagement, and we can measure engagement. And then you don't want to just engage them in anything. Obviously, there's a lot of sites that reach and engage people, but they're probably not learning. You want to make sure that engagement is efficacious. And so this is where we run efficacy studies that, you know, there's 50 plus efficacy studies. Most of them have been in math, but we have a few outside of math, but they tend to tell a similar story that if students are able to even practice 30, 60 minutes a week, it's accelerating them pretty dramatically, 20, 30, 40, 50% more than their peers. And so if we can establish that correlation between engagement and hopefully causality, and we have some evidence that there's a very strong causal link too between we're reaching them, they're using the resources, and then we can do some studies that show that causal link. then that shows kind of how we can broadly increase learning in the world. And even there, we're probably leaving a little bit of the measurable. There's some impact you can maybe measure or estimate, and there's some you can't. We meet a lot of students and they say, oh, yeah, Khan Academy, it was great. And we're like, well, how was it great? How did it help you? And they're like, oh, junior year, I was taking chemistry, and there was this one test, and I was so lost, and it was 2 a.m, and I spent 10 minutes on Khan Academy and unlocked me. So that wouldn't register a lot in our data, that student spent that 10 minutes. It wouldn't be like, what's the big deal there? But for that student, they remember that moment that like, I would have flunked that chemistry class. And we're not able to really measure that impact except for anecdotal surveys, things like that, which we try to do. And then the other dimension of impact is this productivity impact, which I think we're going to see more and more and more. I described a bit of it with teachers, where you're reaching them, you're engaging them, and then how much time are they saving, or how much better is the product they're producing? So teachers will hopefully spend less time writing lesson plans, grading papers, and the quality of the lesson plans will be better. And the grading will be better and more consistent and faster and better feedback for students.
Yeah, excellent. So Sal, what I always like to end with are my so whats. So I want to share what I took away from this, and you let me know what I've missed, what you want to upgrade, etc. But I have to say, at a macro level, you have a very thoughtful approach to what you're trying to do, kind of the mental software. And the so what's with that is you started out kind of assessing where are the big problems here. And there's a high correlation between lack of education and good outcomes for individuals, for societies, for nations, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of at a very broad level you've identified that. You then went down to the next level, that said, hey, listen, a lot of the problems that have existed have been this one-to-many that has created gaps in learning that are highly problematic. You then said, listen, the maturity of the technology, the maturity of AI is such that now a lot of those issues can be addressed. You developed Conmigo and a variety of other services that have allowed you to work across a variety of areas that have worked fairly well. As you advance the product capabilities, you are actually fairly thoughtful about what are the things that can go wrong. As opposed to being what people might consider tech to be highly iterative, throw something out there, see what happens, et cetera. You actually identified where the risks are, where there could be cheating. How do you think about reaction of teachers? How do you think about the data that's being used, et cetera? You're kind of anticipating those issues and then saying this is how the product is going to be designed. And then finally, to keep yourselves honest, you have a measure of success. And you look at reach, you look at engagement, you look at efficacy, and you look at productivity. And if those are trending in the right direction, you know that's the right way to go. If they are not trending, then there's some other kind of iteration you got to go through with Conmigo and otherwise. Is that basically, is that a fair summary of your messages?
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Okay. No upgrades at all. I love this. This is like never any parting comments if you have no upgrades on it.
Yeah, well, I'll just finish. I've spoken at different universities and this, that, and especially in the last couple of years, and and at dinner parties out here in Silicon Valley, and obviously AI is one of the hot topics these days, and people like to have these philosophical conversations about oftentimes all the ways that it can go wrong. And there are going to be, I can let my dog out of this. Let my dog out of the office. But all the ways it can go wrong, and it will go wrong. Or there are people who are there's going to be bad things with AI. You're going to see deep fakes. You're going to see bullying. You're going to see cyber attacks. You're going to see totalitarian governments be able to surveil their populations in ways that, it's going to affect the battlefield. I mean, there's all sorts of things that we should be very concerned about. But I tell people, especially people early in their career, like I think many of the people in this room, technology is fundamentally neutral, and it's an amplification of human intent. You can go back thousands of years, the ability to create and control fire is a technology, and it can be used to burn and harm and destroy, but it can also be used to keep you warm and save lives and prepare food. A knife can be used to harm. A knife can be used as a tool. Same thing as with AI. It's going to amplify intent. We already know it's going to amplify bad actors' intent, people who want to harm, undermine, et cetera. It'll probably amplify people with lazy intent, people who don't want to do their papers, et cetera, et cetera. And so the question is, do you just let it does do the rest of us just kind of wring our hands and say, oh yeah, this is scary stuff, let's just, not do anything? Well, then you're pretty much ensuring we're leading to a dystopian world. What I say is, like, we have no choice. If you think you have positive intent, to really lean into this and be thoughtful about it. Don't just throw things and, see what happens, but amplify your positive intent in whatever area it is. And if more, and I think most people are good people with positive intent, if they really invest and put the resources and run faster than the bad actors, they can, one, protect against the bad actors, but also do all sorts of amazing things. I mean, I think we've just, the tip of the iceberg on education, healthcare. We could go on and on and on down the list. And then we could get closer to a utopian a world. And I'll say one last thing is, these days it's very easy to get, you see obviously the election and this and that and big tech and this and social media. And it's very easy to get down on the world right now. But I remind everyone I talk to, this is like the most exciting time in world history to be alive. And the folks in this room are in the best position. We are the luckiest people in this best time in world history to be alive. And it's going to be super exciting. And as long as we really lean into it, amplify positive intent, I think it's some pretty cool things are going to happen. Drug discovery, disease cured, travel the cosmos, et cetera.
Yeah. Sal, let me just say a huge thank you. I can't think of a better kickoff speaker here. And the fact that you've got a positive, insightful vision about the use of technology, about where it can truly help others, is such a great role model for many. So best wishes on continued success with Conmigo, and a big thank you for your time this morning. I hope we can have you back again very soon. Great job.
Thank you.